A Death in the Family by James Agee. Knoxville, summer 1915. We are talking now of summer evenings in Knoxville, Tennessee, in the time that I lived there so successfully disguised to myself as a child. It was a little bit mixed sort of block, fairly solidly lower middle class, with one or two juts apiece on either side of that. The houses corresponded. Middle-sized, gracefully fretted wood houses built in the late 90s and early 1900s, with small front and side and more spacious backyards, and trees in the yards, and porches. These were soft-wooded trees, poplars, tulip trees, cottonwoods. There were fences around one or two of the houses, but mainly the yards ran into each other with only now and then a low hedge that wasn't doing very well. There were few good friends among the grown people, and they were not poor enough for the other sort of intimate acquaintance. But everyone nodded and spoke, and even might talk short times, trivially, and at the two extremes of the general or the particular. And ordinarily next-door neighbors talked quite a bit when they happened to run into each other, and never paid calls. The men were mostly small businessmen, one or two very modestly executives. One or two worked with their hands, most of them clerical, and most of them between 30 and 45. But it is of these evenings I speak. Supper was at 6 and was over by 1:30. There was still daylight, shining softly and with a tarnish, like the lining of a shell. And the carbon lamps lifted at the corners were on in the light. And the locusts were started, and the fireflies were out, and a few frogs were flopping in the dewy grass, by the time the fathers and the children came out. The children ran out first, hell-bent and yelling those names by which they were known. Then the fathers sank out leisurely in crossed suspenders, their collars removed and their necks looking tall and shy. The mothers stayed back in the kitchen, washing and drying, putting things away, recrossing their traceless footsteps like the lifetime journeys of bees, measuring out the dry cocoa for breakfast. When they came out, they had taken off their aprons, and their skirts were dampened, and they sat in rockers on their porches quietly. It is not of the games children play in the evening that I want to speak now. It is of a contemporaneous atmosphere that has little to do with them. That of the fathers of families, each in his space of lawn, his shirts fish-like pale in the unnatural light, and his face nearly anonymous, hosing their lawns. The hoses were attached as spigots that stood out of the brick foundations of the houses. The nozzles were variously set, but usually so there was a long, sweet stream of spray, the nozzle wet in the hand, the water trickling in the right forearm, and the peeled back cuff, and the water wishing over a long, loose, and low-curved cone, and so gentle a sound. First an insane noise of violence in the nozzle, then the still irregular sound of adjustment, then the smoothing into steadiness, and the pitch as accurately tuned to the size and style of stream as any violin. So many qualities of sound out of one hose, so many choral differences out of those several hoses that were in earshot. Out of any one hose, the almost dead silence of the release, and the short, still arch of the separate big drops, silent as a held breath, and the only noise, the flattering noise on leaves and the slapped grass at the fall of each big drop. That, and the intense hiss with the intense stream. That, and that same intensity now growing less but growing more quiet and delicate with the turn of the nozzle, up to the extreme tender whisper when the water was just a wide bell of film. Chiefly, though, the hoses were set very much alike, in a compromise between distance and tenderness of spray. and quite surely a sense of art's behind this compromise, and a quiet deep joy, too real to recognize itself. And the sounds therefore were pitched much alike, pointed by the snorting start of a new hose, decorated by some man playful with the nozzle, left empty, like God by the sparrow's fall, when any single one of them desists, and all, though near alike, of various pitch, and in this unison. These sweet pale streamings in the light lift over their pallors and their voices altogether, mothers hushing their children, the hushing unnaturally prolonged, the men gentle and silent, and each snail-like withdrawn into the quietude of what he singly is doing. The urination of huge children stood loosely, military against an invisible wall, and gentle, happy, and peaceful, tasting the mean goodness of their living like the last of their suppers in their mouths. While the locusts carry on this noise of hoses on their much higher and sharper key. The noise of the locust is dry, and it seems not to be rasped or vibrated, but urged from him, as if through a small orifice, by a breath that can never give out. Also there is never one locust, but an illusion of at least 1,000. The noise of each locust is pitched in some classic locust range out of which none of them varies more than 2 full tones. And yet you seem to hear each locust discrete from all the rest, and there is a long, slow pulse in their noise, like the scarcely defined arch of a long and high-set bridge. They are all around in every tree, so that the noise seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, from the whole shell heaven, shivering in your flesh and teasing your eardrums, the boldest of all the sounds of night. And yet it is habitual to summer nights, and is of the great order of noises, like the noises of the sea and of the blood her precocious grandchild, which you realize you are hearing only when you catch yourself listening. Meanwhile, from low in the dark, just outside the spraying horizons of the hoses, conveying always grass and the damp of dew and a strong green-black smear of smell, the regular yet spaced noises of the crickets, each a sweet cold silver noise 3-noted, like the slipping each time of 3 matched links of a small chain. But the men by now, one by one, have silenced their hoses and drained and coiled them. Now only 2, and now only 1 is left, and you see only ghost-like shirt, with the sleeves garters, and sober mystery of his mild face like the lifted face of a large cattle, inquiring of your presence in a pitch-dark pool of meadow. And now he too is gone, and it has become that time of evening when people sit on their porches, rocking gently and talking gently, and watching the streets and the standing up into their sphere of possession of the trees, of birds hung havens, hangers. People go by, things go by. A horse, drawing a buggy, breaking his hollow iron music on the asphalt. A loud auto, a quiet auto. People in pairs, not in a hurry, scuffling, switching their weights of estival body, talking casually, the taste hovering over them of vanilla, strawberry, pasteboard and starched milk. The image upon them of lovers and horsemen, squared with clowns and hueless amber. A streetcar raising its iron moan, stopping, belling and starting. Stertorous, rousing and raising again its iron increasing moan, and swimming its gold windows and straw seats on past and past and past. The bleak spark crackling and cursing above it, like a small malignant spirit set to dog its tracks. The iron wine rises on rising speed, still risen, faints, halts. The faint, stinging bell rises again, still fainter, fainting, lifting, lifts, faints forgotten, forgotten. Now is the night one blue dew. Now is the night one blue dew. My father has drained, he has coiled the hose. Low on the length of lawns, a frailing of fire who breathes. Content, silver, like peeps of light, each cricket makes his comments over and over in the drowned grass. A cold toad thumpily flounders. Within the edges of damp shadows of side yards are hovering children, nearly sick with joy of fear, who watch the unguarding of a telephone pole. Around white carbon corner lamps, bugs of all sizes are lifted elliptic, solar systems. Big hard shells bruise themselves, assailant. He is falling on his back, legs squiggling. Parents on porches, rock and rock. From damp strings morning glories, hang their ancient faces. The dry and exalted noise of the locusts from all the air at once enchants my eardrums. On the rough wet grass of the backyard, my father and mother have spread quilts. We all lie there. My mother, my father, my uncle, my aunt, and I too am lying there. First we were sitting up, then one of us lay down, and then we all lay down, on our stomachs, or on our sides, or on our backs, and they have kept on talking. They are not talking much, and the talk is quiet, of nothing in particular, of nothing at all in particular, of nothing at all. The stars are wide and alive, they seem each like a smile of great sweetness, and they seem very near. All my people are larger bodies than mine, quiet, with voices gentle and meaningless like the voices of sleeping birds. One is an artist, he is living at home. One is a musician, she is living at home. One is my mother who is good to me. One is my father who is good to me. By some chance, here they are, all on this earth. And who shall ever tell the sorrow of being on this earth, lying on quilts, on the grass, in a summer evening, among the sounds of the night? May God bless my people, my uncle, my aunt, my mother, my good father. I'll remember them kindly in their time of trouble, and in their hour of their taking away. After a little I am taken in and put to bed. Sleep, soft smiling, draws me unto her, and those receive me who quietly treat me as one familiar and well-beloved in that home. But will not, oh, will not now, not ever, but will not ever tell me who I am. Part 1, Chapter 1. At supper that night, as many times before, his father said, "Well, suppose we go to the picture show." "Oh, Jay," his mother said, "that horrid little man." "What's wrong with him?" his father asked, not because he didn't know what she would say, but so she would say it. "He's so nasty," she said, as she always did. "So vulgar, with his nasty little cane, hooking up skirts and things, and that nasty little walk." His father laughed, as he always did, and Rufus felt that it had become rather an empty joke. But as always, the laughter also cheered him. He felt that the laughter enclosed him with his father. They walked downtown in the light of mother of pearl, to the Majestic, and found their way to seats by the light of the screen, an exhilarating smell of stale tobacco, rank sweat, perfume and dirty drawers, while the piano played fast music and galloping horses raised a grandiose flag of dust. And there was William S. Hart with both guns blazing, and his long hoarse face and his long hard lip, and the great country rolled away behind him as wide as the world. Then he made a bashful face at a girl, and his horse raised his upper lip, and everybody laughed. And then the screen was filled with the city, and with the sidewalk of a side street of a city, a long line of palms, and there was Charlie. Everybody laughed the minute they saw him squattily walking with his toes out and his knees wide apart, as if he were chaffed. Rufus's father laughed, and Rufus laughed too. This time, Charlie stole a whole bag of eggs, and when the cop came along, he hid them in the seat of his pants. Then he caught sight of a pretty woman, and he began to squat and twirl his cane and make silly faces. She tossed her head and walked away with her chin up high and her dark mouth as small as she could make it. And he followed her very busily, doing all sorts of things with his cane that made everybody laugh. But she paid no attention. Finally, she stopped at a corner to wait for a streetcar, turning her back to him and pretending he wasn't even there. And after trying to get her attention for a while, and not succeeding, he looked out at the audience, shrugged his shoulders, and acted as if she wasn't there. But after tapping his foot for a little, pretending he didn't care, he became interested again, and with a charming smile tipped his derby. But she only stiffened and tossed her head again, and everybody laughed. Then he walked back and forth behind her, looking at her and squatting a little while he walked very quietly. And everybody laughed again. Then he flicked hold of the straight end of his cane and, with the crooked end, hooked up her skirt to the knee, in exactly the way that disgusted Mama, looking very eagerly at her legs, and everybody laughed very loudly. But she pretended she had not noticed. Then he twirled his cane and suddenly squatted, bending the cane and hitching up his pants, and again hooked up her skirt so that he could see the panties she wore, ruffled almost like the edges of curtains, and everybody whooped with laughter. And she suddenly turned in rage and gave him a shove in the chest, and he sat down straight-legged, hard enough to hurt, and everybody whooped again. And she walked haughtily away up the street, forgetting about the streetcar. "Mad as a hornet," as his father exclaimed in delight. And there was Charlie, flat on his bottom on the sidewalk, and the way he looked, kind of sickly and disgusted. You could see that he suddenly remembered those eggs, and suddenly you remembered them too. The way his face looked, with the lip wrinkled off the teeth and the sickly little smile, it made you feel just the way those broken eggs must felt against your seat, as queer and awful as that time in the white piqué suit, when it ran down out of the pants legs and shouted all over your stockings and you had to walk home that way with people looking. And Rufus's father nearly tore his head off laughing, and so did everybody else. And Rufus was sorry for Charlie, having been so recently in a similar predicament. But the contagion of laughter was too much for him, and he laughed too. And then it was even funnier when Charlie very carefully got himself up from the sidewalk, with a sickly look even worse on his face, and put his cane under one arm, and began to pick at his pants, front and back, very carefully, with his little fingers crooked, as if it were too dirty to touch, picking the sticky cloth away from his skin. Then he reached behind him and took out the wet bag of broken eggs and opened it and peered in, and took out a broken egg and pulled the shell disgustedly apart, letting the elastic yolk slump from one half shell into the other, and dropped it, shuddering. Then he peered in again and fished out a whole egg, all slimy with broken yolk, and polished it off carefully on his sleeve, and looked at it again, and wrapped it up in his dirty handkerchief, and put it carefully in the vest pocket of his little coat. Then he whipped out his cane from under his armpit and took command of it again, and with a final look at everybody, still sickly but at the same time cheerful, shrugged his shoulders, and turned his back, and scrapped backward with his big shoes at the broken shells in the slimy bag, just like a dog, and looked back at the mess. Everybody laughed again at that, and started to walk away, bending his cane deep with every shuffle, and squaring deeper, with his knees wider apart than ever before, constantly picking at the seat of his pants with his left hand, and shaking one foot, then the other, and once gouging deep into his seat and then pausing and shaking his whole body like a wet dog, then walking on. While the screen shut over his small image a sudden circle of darkness. Then the player piano changed its tune, and the ass came in the motionless color. They sat on into the William S. Hart feature to make sure why he had killed the man with the fancy vest. It was as they had expected by her frightened, pleased face after the killing. He had insulted a girl and cheated her father as well. And Rufus's father said, "Well, reckon this is where we came in." But then watched them kill the man all over again. Then they walked out. It was full dark now, but still early. Gay Street was full of absorbed faces. Many of the store's windows were still alight. Plaster people, in ennobled postures, stiffly wore untouchably new clothes. There was even a little boy, with short, straight pants, bare knees and high socks, obviously a sissy. But he wore a cape, all the same, not a hat like a baby. Rufus's whole inside lifted and sank as he looked at the cape, and he looked up at his father. But his father did not notice. His face was wrapped in good humor, the memory of Charlie. Remembering his rebuff of a year ago, even though it had been his mother, Rufus was afraid to speak of it. His father wouldn't mind, but she wouldn't want him to have a cape yet. If he asked his father now, his father would say no. Charlie Chaplin was enough. He watched the absorbed faces pushing past each other and the great bright letters on the signs. Sturchie's, George's. I could read them now, he reflected. I even know how to say Sturkey's. But he thought it best not to say so. He remembered how his father had said, "Don't you brag." He had been puzzled and rather stupid in school for several days because of the stern tone in his voice. What was bragging? It was bad. They turned aside into a darker street, where the fewer faces looked more secret, and came into the odd shaky light of Market Square. It was almost empty at this hour, but here and there, along the pavement streaked with horse urine, a wagon stayed still, and low firelights shone through the white cloth, shell stretched tightly on its hickory hoops. A dark-faced man leaned against a white brick wall, gnawing a turnip. He looked at them low, with sad, pale eyes. When Rufus's father raised his hand in silent greeting, he raised his hand, but less, and Rufus, turning, saw how he looked sorrowfully, somehow dangerously, after them. They passed a wagon in which a lantern burned low orange. There lay a whole family, large and small, silent, asleep. In the tail of one wagon a woman sat, her face narrow beneath her flare of sunbonnet, her dark eyes in its shade, like smudges of soot. Rufus's father averted his eyes and touched his straw hat lightly, and Rufus, looking back, saw how her dead eyes kept looking gently ahead of her. "Well," his father said, "reckon our host meet a couple." They turned through the swinging doors into a blast of odor and sound. There was no music, only the density of bodies and of the smell of a market bar, of beer, whiskey, and country bodies, salt and leather. No clamor, only the thick quietude of crumpled talk. Rufus stood looking at the light on a damp spittoon, and he heard his father ask for whiskey, and knew he was looking up and down the bar for men he might know. but they seldom come from so far away as Polwell River Valley, and Rufus soon realized that his father had found, tonight, no one he knew. He looked up his father's length and watched him bend backwards, tossing one off in one jolt in a lordly manner, and in a moment later heard him say to the man next to him, "That's my boy," and felt a warmth of love. Next moment he felt his father's hands under his armpits, and he was lifted, high, and seated on the bar, looking into a long row of huge bristling and bearded red faces. The eyes of the men nearest him were interested and kind. Some of them smiled. Further away, the eyes were impersonal and questioning, but now even some of these began to smile. Somewhat timidly, and feeling assured that his father was proud of him and that he was liked, and liked these men, he smiled back. And suddenly, many of the men laughed. He was disconcerted by their laughter and lost his smile a moment. Then, realizing he was friendly, smiled again, and again they laughed. His father smiled at him. "There's my boy," he said warmly. 6 years old, and he can already read like I couldn't read when I was twice his age. Rufus felt a sudden hollowness in his voice, and all along the bar and in his own heart. But how does he fight? He thought. You don't brag about smartness if your son is brave. He felt the anguish of shame, but his father did not seem to notice, except that as suddenly as he had lifted him up to the bar, he gently lifted him down again. "Reckon I'll have another," he said, and drank it more slowly. Then, with a few good nights, they went out. His father proffered a lifesaver, courteously, man to man. He took it with a special sense of courtesy. It sealed their contract. Only once had his father felt it necessary to say to him, "I wouldn't tell your mama if I were you." He had known, from then on, that he could trust Rufus, and Rufus had felt gratitude in this silent trust. They walked away from Market Square, along a dark and nearly empty street, sucking their lifesavers, and Rufus's father reflected, without particular concern, that lifesavers were not quite lifesaver enough. He had better play very tired tonight, and turn away the minute they got in bed. The deaf and dumb asylum was deaf and dumb, his father observed very quietly, as if he were careful not to wake it, as he always did on these evenings. Its windows showed black in its pale brick as a nursing woman's eyes, and it stood deep in silence among the light shadows of the trees. Ahead, Asylum Avenue lay bleak beneath its lamps. Latticed and pawnshop iron, an old saber caught the glints of a street lamp, and Mandolin's belly glowed. In a closed drugstore stood Venus de Merlo, her golden body laced in elastic straps. The stained glass of the L&N depot smoldered like an exhausted butterfly, and at the middle of the viaduct they paused to inhale the burst of smoke from a switch engine which passed under. Rufus, lifted, the cinder stinging his face, was grateful no longer to feel fear at this suspension over the tracks and the powerful locomotives. Far down the yard, a red light flicked to green. A moment later, they heard the thrilling click. It was 10:07 by the depot clock. They went on, more idly than before. If I could fight, thought Rufus, if I were brave, he would never brag how I could read. Brag, of course. Don't you brag. That was it. What it meant, don't brag you're smart if you're not brave. You got nothing to brag about. Don't you brag. The young leaves of Forest Avenue wavered against street lamps as they approached the corner. It was a vacant lot, part rubbed bare clay, part overgrown with weeds, rising a little from the sidewalk. A few feet in from the sidewalk there was a medium-sized tree, and, near enough to be within its shade in daytime, an outcrop of limestone like a great bundle of dirty laundry. If he sat on a certain part of it, the trunk of the tree shut off the weak street lamp a block away, and it seemed very dark. Whenever they walked downtown and walked back home, in the evenings, they always began to walk more slowly, from about the middle of the viaduct, and as they came near this corner, they walked more slowly still, but with purpose, and paused a moment at the edge of the sidewalk. Then, without speaking, stepped into the dark lot and sat down on the rock, looking out over the steep face of the hill and at the lights of North Knoxville. Deep in the valley, an engine coughed and browsed. Couplings settled their long chains, and an empty car sounded like broken drums. A man came up on the far side of the street, walking neither slow nor fast, not turning his head as he paused, and quite surely not noticing them. They watched him until he was out of sight, and Rufus felt, and was sure that his father felt, that though there was no harm in the man, and he had as good a right as they did to be there, minding his own business, their journey was interrupted from the moment they first saw him until they saw him out of sight. Once he was out of sight, they realized more pleasure in their privacy than before. They really relaxed in it. They looked across the darkness to the lights of North Knoxville. They were aware of the quiet leaves above them, and looked into them and through them. They looked between the leaves into the stars. Usually on these evening waits, or a few minutes before going on home, Rufus's father smoked a cigarette through. And when it was finished, it was time to get up and go on home. But this time he did not smoke. Up to recently, he had always said something about Rufus's being tired, when they were still about a block away from the corner. But lately he had not done so. And Rufus realized that his father stopped as much because he wanted to, as on Rufus's account. He was just not in a hurry to get home, Rufus realized. And, far more important, it was clear that he liked to spend these few minutes with Rufus. Rufus had come recently to feel a quiet kind of anticipation of the corner, from the moment they finished crossing the viaduct. And during the 10 to 20 minutes they sat on the rock, a particular kind of contentment, unlike any other that he knew. He did not know what this was, in words or ideas, or what the main reason was. It was simply all that he saw and felt. It was, mainly, knowing that his father, too, felt a particular kind of contentment, here, unlike any other, and that their kinds of contentment were very much alike, and depended on each other. Rufus seldom had at all sharply the feeling that he and his father was estranged, yet they must have been, and he must have felt it. For always during these quiet moments on the rock, a part of his sense of complete contentment lay in the feeling that they were reconciled, that there was really no division, no estrangement, or none so strong, anyhow, that it could mean much, by comparison with the unity that was so firm and assured. Here. He felt that although his father loved their home and loved all of them, he was more lonely than the contentment of this family love could help. That it even increased his loneliness, or made it hard for him not to be lonely. He felt that sitting out here, he was not lonely. Or, if he was, that he felt on good terms with the loneliness. That he was a homesick man, and that here on the rock, though he might be more homesick than ever, he was well. He knew that a very important part of his well-being came of staying a few minutes away from home, very quietly, in the dark, listening to the leaves if they moved, and looking at the stars. And that his own, Rufus's own presence, was fully as indispensable to this well-being. He knew that each of them knew of the other's well-being, and of the reasons for it, and knew how each depended on the other, how each meant more to the other, in this most important of all ways, than anyone or anything else in the world, and that the best of this well-being lay in this mutual knowledge, which was neither concealed nor revealed. He knew these things very distinctly, but not, of course, in any such way as we have of suggesting them in words. There were no words, or even ideas, or formed emotions of the kind that have been suggested here, no more in the man than in the boy-child. These realizations moved clearly through the senses, the memory, the feelings, the mere feeling of the place they paused at, about a quarter of a mile from home, on a rock under a stray tree that had grown in the city, their feet on undomesticated clay, facing north through the night over the southern railway tracks and over North Knoxville, towards the deeply folded small mountains in the Powwow River Valley, and above them, the trembling lanterns of the universe, seeming so near, so intimate, that when air stirred the leaves in their hair, it seemed to be the breathing, the whispering of the stars. Sometimes on these evenings his father would hum a little, and the humming would break open into a word or two. But he never finished even a part of a tune, for silence was even more pleasurable, and sometimes he would even say a few words, of very little consequence, but would never seek to say much, or to finish what he was saying, or to listen for a reply. For silence again was even more pleasurable. Sometimes, Rufus had noticed, he would stroke the wrinkled rock and press his hand firmly against it. And sometimes he would put out his cigarette and tear and scatter it before it was half finished. But this time he was much quieter than ordinarily. They slackened their walking a little sooner than usual and walked a little more slowly, without a word, to the corner, and hesitated before stepping off the sidewalk into the clay, purely for the luxury of hesitation, and took their place on the rock without breaking silence. As always, Rufus's father took off his hat and put it over the front of his bent knee, and as always, Rufus imitated him, but this time his father did not roll a cigarette. They waited while the man came by, intruding on their privacy, and disappeared, as someone nearly always did, and then relaxed sharply into the pleasure of their privacy. But this time Rufus's father did not hum, nor did he say anything, nor even touch the rock with his hand, but sat with his hands hung between his knees and looked out over North Knoxville, hearing the restive assemblage of the train, and after there had been silence for a while, raised his head and looked up into the leaves and between the leaves into the broad stars, not smiling, but with his eyes more calm and grave, and his mouth strong and more quiet than Rufus had ever seen his eyes and his mouth. And as he watched his father's face, Rufus felt his father's hand settle, without groping or clumsiness, on the top of his bare head. It took his forehead and smoothed it, and pushed the hair backwards from his forehead, and held the back of his head while Rufus pressed his head backward against the firm hand, and, in reply to that pressure, clasped over his right ear and cheek, over the whole side of the head, and drew Rufus's head quietly and strongly against the sharp cloth that covered his father's body, through which Rufus could feel the breathing ribs. Then relinquished him, and Rufus sat upright, while the hand lay strongly on his shoulder, and he saw that his father's eyes had become still more clear and grave, and that the deep lines around his mouth were satisfied, and looked up at what his father was so steadily looking at the leaves which silently breathed and at the stars which beat like hearts. He heard a long, deep sigh break from his father, and then his father's abrupt voice, "Well?" And the hand lifted from him, and they both stood up. The rest of the way home they did not speak or put on their hats. When he was near asleep, Rufus heard once more the crumpling of freight cars, and deep in the night he heard the crumpling of subdued voices and the words, "Nah, I'll probably be back before they're asleep." Then quick feet creaking quietly downstairs. But by the time he heard the creaking and departure of the Ford, he was already so deeply asleep that it seemed only a part of his dream. And by next morning, when his mother explained to them why his father was not at breakfast, he had so forgotten the words and the noises that years later, when he remembered them, you could never be sure that he was not making them up.